This week on the Lure of Flanders show, Rachel and Ellen Meeropol, a mother and daughter each seeking change, one through litigation, the other through fiction. Then Boots Riley of the Coup and the Street Sweeper Social Club on his personal history and the history of resistance. Plus a look back at Occupy Wall Street and the politicians who are getting slandered now. Welcome to our program. We're a storytelling people, but how do we tell the stories of our fights for justice? Our next guests take on that challenge in their different ways. Ellen Meeropol is the author of 2 novels that deal with law, justice, and government surveillance. Her most recent book, On Hurricane Island, explores a fictional, secret domestic detention and interrogation camp for citizens. Ellen's daughter, Rachel Meeropol, is the senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, where she works on prisoners' rights, Muslim profiling, the criminalization of dissent, and where she's defended, among others, environmental and animal rights activists targeted by the so-called Green Scare. These issues have affected both of their lives. Ellen's father and mother-in-law, Rachel's grandparents, were Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were executed by the U.S. government as spies. Welcome both. So glad to have you on the program.
So glad to be here.
Let's start with Hurricane Island. Handsome book, fascinating premise. Lay it out just a little bit for people that haven't had a chance to read it yet.
It's about a 60-year-old woman who is going through security at JFK and is pulled out of line. She is hooded and cuffed and flown to a secret detention center in Maine, off the coast of Maine, on an island.
Now, Gandalf is her name, right?
Gandalf Cohen.
Quite a character. Did you start with her or with the politics? How did this all come into your brain?
I was going through airport security at JFK, and she materialized in front of me. This character, full-blown. I knew she was a math professor who studies hurricanes. I knew she was a lesbian. I could hear her odd, kind of stilted way of speaking. So it all started with the character. And in my mind, as I saw her taken away, I said, I got to know what happened to her.
When we find out, at least some of it. In your work, Rachel, well, you went into the law first. Why? Was that an obvious choice?
Well, I guess I grew up with a pretty profound sense of justice and injustice, and the idea that justice isn't something that happens naturally, that in fact, it can go the other way all too quickly. I grew up thinking about sort of differences in power, and it seemed to me that the starkest difference in power that exists in this country exists in the prison system. It's a place where there are the largest extremes. The jailers have all the power and the prisoners have none. And that really stuck with me growing up, thinking about, of course, my grandparents in prison before they were executed, and it led me to law school, and that led me to prisoners' rights work.
Yeah, and that prisoners' rights work had actually intersected with your mother's novels around these issues of detention. Talk a bit about the Turkman v. Ashcroft case that you've been on from the beginning.
Right. Well, so as many in New York especially will remember, shortly after 9/11, Muslim and South Asian and Arab men sort of began disappearing off the streets of New York and New Jersey. It happened across the country, but it was more focused here in New York. And we later learned that these men were encountered or the subject of citizen tips. So people were calling up the FBI saying things like, my neighbor's Arab and he keeps strange hours. I think he might be a terrorist. Literally that kind of information. And on that, a team of FBI, INS, and NYPD officers would be dispatched to to investigate the individual. If they determined that he was here in violation of the immigration law, overstaying his visa, maybe working unlawfully, he was arrested and held in connection to the terrorism investigation, and then detained under John Ashcroft's orders until cleared of any connection to terrorism.
Who was the Attorney General at the time?
Who was the Attorney General at the time, of course. Many of these men were held in Brooklyn at the Metropolitan Detention Center, where they were placed in super maximum security confinement. Although they were civil immigration detainees whose only connection to terrorism was their religion, their ethnicity, custody. These were men who were treated as if they were terrorists, though there was no reason to suspect them individually of anything. They were beaten, they were abused for months, and then cleared of all connection to terrorism and deported. So along with them, we at the Center for Constitutional Rights have been fighting now for 13 years, really, to hold accountable the people who ordered these detentions.
It wasn't like this policy just sprang into action after 9/11. Its roots are much longer than that.
Well, right. I mean, if you look at the power of the immigration law in itself, the only reason why the government had the power to round up all of these individuals is that there are millions of people here every day who are undocumented, and those individuals are incredibly vulnerable to detention. And because they're vulnerable to detention, they're vulnerable to abuse. It's getting back to that division of power.
You work on another case that has to do with solitary confinement. Ashker v. Brown?
Yes, that's correct.
What's the nature of that case?
That's a challenge to prolong solitary confinement in California's notorious Pelican Bay prison, where men have been held for 10, 20, 25 years in solitary confinement based on alleged gang affiliation rather than prison misconduct.
Certainly the Rosenberg story has been fictionalized for better and for ill. You've felt that, I'm sure. And you have clients who, in some form or another, are sometimes showing up in movies. Again, sometimes good, sometimes not so much.
Well, certainly I think it's incredibly important in the kind of work I do, especially when representing people who are imprisoned or disappeared, to try to come up with a way for the larger public to connect to them as individuals. It is so hard to look at something that's happening, religious profiling and sweeps of people, and to see them as individuals if you don't actually know that person. But these are, my clients, especially in the Turkman case, these are people I actually could have known in my neighborhood. I was living 10 blocks from the Metropolitan Detention Center after 9/11. And I remember one of my clients telling me early on that after he had been sort of arrested in his apartment in the middle of the night, taken by SWAT team with like the streets of Brooklyn closed down and helicopter support, and brought into this jail where he was slammed against the wall by huge guards and told, welcome to America, terrorist, and then put in isolation for days with seeing no one. But all of a sudden he started thinking, maybe I did it. Maybe I am a terrorist. It's that kind of piece of information, how that feels internally to be put in that situation. How does an individual react? That is so hard to tell that story through a legal case.
So are all bets off? Open season for fiction? If you can just get to that feeling, it doesn't matter how you get there vis-a-vis the facts?
It's a complicated issue for me, because I really have not liked most of the fictionalized versions of the Rosenberg case. But I also think that fiction is one of the most powerful tools we have to make people understand what it feels like to be in another skin, to see the world through other eyes.
Tony Kushner's Angels in America, of course, has an Ethel Rosenberg character.
I love it.
I think she would have liked that one. Do you think?
Yeah. That's one of the exceptions. I think it's such a brilliant work, and it's so powerful.
Just quickly, the Green Scare, people are familiar with the Red Scare, but what was the Green Scare, or what is it now?
So over the last decade or so, there has been sort of extreme targeting of animal rights and environmental activists. There was a time when the FBI labeled them the #1 domestic terrorist threat, despite the fact that folks in the animal rights movement who were labeled that, there's never been an act of violence against an individual in this country. And with the passage in 2006 of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which is just an incredibly confusing piece of federal criminal legislation that makes it a crime to cause damage to an animal enterprise, or to cause an animal enterprise to lose profit, lose property. This is an act of terrorism. It's a terrorism act that targets individuals who are protesting and taking sometimes lawful, sometimes unlawful actions against businesses that use or sell animal products. So going after this sort of one segment of activists as somehow incredibly dangerous has come to be known as the Green Scare.
And this is happening very soon after we've seen doctors who provide abortions actually be killed on the job and the rights of the protesters there be protected, at least to an
Right,
extent.
right. It's remarkable, the juxtaposition, really. And I think what it comes down to is, corporate interests in the idea that individuals who challenge violence against animals, individuals who challenge the way in which our current practices are destroying our world and our environment, that threatens corporate bottom lines. It's incredibly dangerous to the way we live our lives because it says that what our whole system is based on is a system of violence and destruction of the environment. And the only way to counter the reality, I think, of that sort of activism, is to demonize it, is to say, no, those people, they're radical, they're fringe, you can't listen to them, they're terrorists.
Now that takes us right back to the Rosenbergs again.
Right.
People who were demonized, people who were described as terrorists and a real threat to the state. Talk to people today, and this is where we'll close, about what this story, what the legacy of that has been. Because you could look at the story of the two of you and say, the legacy's actually been to grow dissent.
Well, I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. I don't quarrel with that at all.
Yeah.
I think, the only other piece I would take from it is to say that sometimes it's a really long struggle. We're still not at the end of it, right? I think I'd like to imagine a day where, the story of the Rosenbergs is known to everyone as a story of government oppression and abuse, not a story of treason, right? But I think we're working our way towards that day, and hopefully we'll continue to work our way towards that day.
Well, thank you both. Ellen and Rachel, it's been a great time talking to you. I've had a great time talking to you. Thanks for coming.
Me too. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
You can find more information about each of their books and their work at our website. Thanks. For more on art and resistance, I spoke recently with poet, lyricist, MC, screenwriter, and organizer Boots Riley, founder and frontman of the Oakland-based hip-hop group, The Coup. He's also the author of a brand new book, Tell Homeland Security We Are the Bomb. Watch now to see part 1 of our conversation. Watch again next week to see part 2. Organizing was tied in early to your life. Your family were organizers. I've heard that phrase a lot, but I haven't heard you really talk about what they did or who they were. Introduce them to us, if you would.
So my father was he joined the NAACP when he was 12 years old in the 50s, and actually left the church because the church wouldn't support the civil rights movement.
What church was he in?
Some sort. My grandmother actually was a Pentecostal preacher, so I don't know the name of the church, but he was kicked out of that church because he stood up and said that in church and said that the church needs to join the civil rights movement, and the pastor said, well, that's blasphemy because those are worldly things. A lot of black churches weren't in the civil rights movement, which was why there was a need for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But anyway, so they said that's blasphemy. And then my father said in church, well, if Jesus doesn't want to be part of my freedom, I don't want any part of Jesus. And so he was kicked out. Hasn't gone back. He was then in NAACP in CORE in Durham, and was part of the organizing efforts that led to some of the first sit-ins in other parts of North Carolina. And then CORE moved him to San Francisco, and he got involved in more radical politics, and he joined SDS and Progressive Labor Party. He was involved in the San Francisco State Strike, where he met my mother, who was a student.
Talk a bit about your take on, well, we're talking about social movements, your take on the Black Panthers and their successes and maybe things they could have done differently. Because they tried to address some of the things you're talking about, both the social, the basic needs, the defiance, having some might to actually go up against the state.
So I definitely had a period in my life where I was very obsessed with the Panthers. I read numerous books that I could get my hand on. I think like the best book is David Hilliard's book, This Side of Glory, and ended up working with a lot of them. We had an organization called the Mau Mau Rhythm Collective early on that a lot of ex-Panthers would bring their kids and make them join us, and, you know. But I think that there's a lot of focus put on that organization without looking at not just critiquing what they were doing, but critiquing what they were doing with regard to the actual effect it had at the time. So for instance, you know, even in the late 60s, the Panthers would hold a rally and it was mainly white people, right? And which is, obviously everyone needs to be organized, but for an organization that was saying that their mission was to organize the black community, it says something about about the effect that they were having. And some of that had to do with some of that had to do with stuff that they identified, which was the spectacle. For instance, the Panthers stopped wearing the berets and the leather jackets in 1968. They existed for a while after that, but we only see the pictures of them with the berets and the jackets. The reason that they stopped wearing the berets and the jackets is they realized that the spectacle was making people feel like they weren't revolutionary. Like, wow, that is something to look up to, and we support you. Go ahead, keep doing it. So our view even of what the Panthers were is really not. You know, we're looking at those pictures and we're not really seeing what it was. In the late 60s, there were still factories in Oakland. There was still a way to organize around that. And people of color are human beings. We're trying to survive, right? And so while there was stuff around free breakfast programs and things like that, it still had the same problem as we all have, showing people the way of what's our power base. And so I think we don't look at that like, and so for a lot of time, you know, when I went to college and for a long time after, it was kind of like, we need to bring this back to the days of, to the 1960s. But no, we don't need to bring it back to the 1960s. We need to bring it back to the 20s and 30s as far as the strategy.
We've done a lot of coverage on this program of new economic efforts to bring sort of economic might into the hands of communities that don't have it. Talk about how you see those two things connecting in your worldview, the kind of extreme policing, extreme racism, and extreme inequality. How do they relate? And are there any groups that are connecting it in a useful way?
Racism has a utility in capitalism. That's why it exists. One of those utilities is to say, okay, so first of all, the reason there's a need for it is that capitalism must have unemployment, right? In order to keep wages low, there needs to be an army of unemployed people so that your boss can say, look, you can get fired and blah, 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 keep these wages. Matter of fact, Wall Street Journal and all these folks, they get worried when the unemployment rate goes too low because that means wages are going up. So you have to have unemployed people under capitalism. And unemployed people also have to eat. So we end up having this illegal economy, right? Because that's the jobs that can be created. Follow me. So illegal business, just like legal business, both of them use violence to regulate themselves. Legal business, if you got a supermarket and you got a cart full of groceries, you take it out without paying. somebody's going to physically stop you. And that's going to either be the store security or it's going to be police. So legal business has the police. Illegal business doesn't have the police, they have themselves. So, for instance, right now, you rob a liquor store, you rob the liquor guy, the police come after you. In the 1920s, you rob the liquor guy, the gangsters come after you. It's regulation of business, and that's what causes, it's quote unquote crime, and that's what causes the violence associated with crime. But there's this picture that's put out there, and what they tell us is that it's not poverty. And they tell us that poverty also is created by the bad choices of the impoverished. And how do they tell us that? They show us they show the other and say, hey, these are the folks that are savage, that they're culturally wrong, father's not in the household. Those sorts of things lead to this, and and so here is why poverty happens. And that's why racism is important, because that makes the white working class identify with the system, right? And so there's a utilitarian aspect to that, and that also is what okays the police being in communities of color and beating the hell out of people and murdering them, because those are the culprits. That's what's put out there. So the inequality and racism and abuse that comes from racism and the oppression that comes from racism, it happens more to one group so that they don't have to do it to everyone.
We got love to teach you precious things. We got love to teach you precious things.
For information on Boots Riley's tour and his book, Tell Homeland Security We're the Bomb, visit our website. A year from now, we will be in the election's grimmest days, those weeks before the voting when every scrap of dirt that can be hurled at the candidates will have been unearthed, souped up, and chucked. And whatever can't be unearthed will have simply been made up. According to today's estimates, campaigns are set to spend some $4.4 billion on 2016 political advertising. They call it advertising, but most of those billions will be used to attack. There's little evidence that attack ads actually persuade undecided voters, but they do have real impact, and they create their own credibility, mostly because people in the credibility business, like the media, talk about them. Be it gossip, rumor, or slander, if enough people are talking about a thing, especially on TV and in the papers, it starts to sound as if it's true. Take this cycle. There are plenty of solid reasons to oppose Hillary Clinton for president. She's an awful centrist and a hawk, for starters. But there's precious little evidence to show that she did anything with her emails that every Secretary of State before her didn't also do. And the rules she supposedly broke weren't made until after she left office. As for preserving public records and transparency, the GOP hypocrisy is rank. I don't blame Camp Clinton for screaming to high heaven about Dick Cheney's energy task force, which is still a secret. Still, before you shed real tears for the polls, remember that the name-calling that some of the most powerful people in the world are complaining about now is the very same name-calling some far less powerful people feel all the time. You don't have to recall the witch hunts, the Red Scares, or the FBI's COINTEL program to find victims of this kind of slander. This time of year also marks the 4-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, a national stir that seemed like it could kick off a new grassroots movement until people with influence started casting it as a leaderless muck mussed up by violence, and then failed to cover the actual violence of coordinated police raids on defenseless occupiers. Juvenile predators, welfare queens, illegal aliens, remember them? Some people are getting slandered all the time, usually by people in power to serve their own interests. The difference is, in election year, other people in power get upset about it.